Foundation. We hope everyone had a great Father's Day and so glad that you're back with us here. You know, hard to believe, it seems like the Janus versus AFSCME Supreme Court ruling was maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago. It's actually been 3 years since that landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision. That decision, of course, restoring constitutional rights to public employees, saying that employees did not have to pay mandatory union fees to keep their jobs. Now, despite this victory for worker freedom and choice, public sector unions remain a powerful force, not only in politics, but in public policy, even in right-to-work states like North Carolina. So today, we're going to be talking about the impact of unions on the public, the targeting of North Carolina by powerful union forces, and we're going to revisit the Janus decision to make sure we understand exactly what it said and what the impact has been across the country. We've got some great panelists lined up for you yet again today. Joining us today, Philip Howard is the founder of the Campaign for Common Good. Mark Janus is indeed the Janus of the Supreme Court decision. He is now a senior fellow with the Liberty Justice Center. Representative Sarah Stevens is the Speaker Pro Tem in the North Carolina House of Representatives. And my colleague here at the John Locke Foundation, Dr. Terry Stoops, is the director of the Center for Effective Education. Folks, thanks so much for joining us today. By the way, I want to mention to you, Representative Stevens is joining us by her phone today, so you'll be able to hear her. Our other guests are able to join us by video. Folks, we appreciate all of you giving us some time today. Representative Stevens, let's go ahead and check in with you first. Give us a sense, if you would, of the legislative activities and commitment of the Republican leadership in the General Assembly to protecting North Carolina's right to work status and workers' right to choose and have freedom.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel, and it is a very important discussion. We are interested in trying to do things we can to protect North Carolina as a right-to-work state. I did speak with some of my colleagues in the Senate about their constitutional amendment. I think one of our things is we've gotten burned the last 3 or 4 years on some constitutional amendments that get out there and then don't pass. For example, even the repeal the literacy test, which we all know is a Jim Crow law, we couldn't get passed in North Carolina. So I think they're treading very carefully on there. We are trying to do other things to help make sure that we ensure that North Carolina remains a right to work state. I've been dealing with Becky Gray for several times on NCAE, the teachers unions, which don't profess to be a union, but they say they're not a union, therefore they're not a union. But the first thing you do is when you join them, you're part of the national union. So that's one we've tried to tackle that issue several times, which is why I follow with great interest the Janus decision and see what kind of things we can adopt from that and where we can go from there. We are very supportive of remaining a right to work state. We know that that's one of those things that make us a great state to do business.
You know, Representative Stevens, just to refresh folks some memory about the constitutional amendment, can you give us kind of a brief summary of what that legislation would do?
It would put into the Constitution that we are a right to work state and that people would not be forced to join unions to be part of any kind of business.
And what's interesting about that is that we know that the majority of North Carolinians support that idea. The Civitas poll from early May, in fact, asked a question about that issue. Nearly 2 out of 3, 64%, said they supported an amendment that says the right to work cannot be denied based on whether a person is or is not a member of a labor organization. So that is broad support here in North Carolina. Terry, interesting that Representative Stevens brings up the issue of teachers and the NCAE. Terry, are they a union?
Well, I think they are. And after years of denying that they had any sort of affiliation or union type foundation, they have finally, with new leadership, with new radical leadership that's modeled after the Chicago Teachers Union, have come out and constantly call themselves a union. They adopt union tactics. They believe that calling themselves a union makes them sound more aggressive and more apt to negotiate with legislators. I think they meet the definition of a union, but more than anything, they call themselves a union. And I'm a big believer in calling people what they call themselves. And so after years, like I said, of denying that they had any sort of affiliation with the largest teachers union in the nation, the National Education Association, or denying that they were taking their cues from their national their parent organization. I think now they've firmly established themselves as a union in North Carolina, trying to recruit as many teachers as they can into the organization. Now, they haven't been successful. Over the last 5 years, there's been about a 25% decrease in their active membership. So these new tactics are really a way to try to boost membership, given that the state affiliate here in North Carolina has had some of the largest membership losses of any NEA affiliate in the nation.
And Philip and Mark, want you to jump into this conversation as well. You know, it's fascinating. North Carolina is a battleground in so many ways, political and in terms of public policy. And it does seem that unions are indeed targeting our state. We have a situation with Mission Health over in the Asheville area where we had a vote for a union that was successful. Now we've got reporting from the Asheville Citizen-Times from just a couple of days ago saying that they were having, as they described it, community members noisily taking to the sidewalks in front of Mission Hospital on June 15th. They're in negotiations, contract negotiations. Imagine if you're walking into that hospital for treatment and you're met with people who are essentially, walking back and forth on the sidewalk before you can get in. So private unions, public unions, they seem to want North Carolina.
Well, yeah, and I think one of the big things you have to realize is that once a contract goes into place with a union, whether it be public or private, they put on a lot of restrictions, to the workers themselves. Where in my particular case, even though I wasn't a member of AFSCME, I was still covered by their, agreement. And one of the things I found is like one evening, I had about another 10 minutes to finish up a case I was working on. And I had a union fella come over and tell me that I had to get out of there and leave work at 5 o'clock. And I said, well, I want to finish this up. And he said, no, you can't. Under a contract, you have to leave right now. And he said, because we can't afford to pay you any kind of overtime. And I'm thinking, holy cow, I'm trying to do a good job here, but the union says, no, you can't do a good job. You need to, hit the road. And doesn't make sense to me.
No, it doesn't. Philip, it doesn't make sense.
No, my interest is mainly in public unions. And I think we are at an important time, not just in North Carolina, but in our national history. It sort of seems like our 1917 moment when when the ground is shifting and people are arguing for things that nobody imagined 3 years ago and such. And I think that one thing that people don't realize about public unions is that the collective bargainings effectively disembowel democracy. So if you're in one of those states that has public collective bargaining agreements, like, I live in New York, like New York or California, you can elect somebody to be governor or mayor, but they don't actually have the authority to run the school. They don't actually have the authority to run the police force. Derek Chauvin should have been fired from the Minneapolis police force, or at least reassigned years ago. But the police chief and the mayor of Minneapolis didn't have the authority to do that under the collective bargaining agreement. So I'm actually been writing about why I think collective bargaining agreements in the public sector are unconstitutional because they basically disempower voters. There's a provision in the Constitution that's never really been invoked called the Guarantee Clause, that guarantees that there'll be a Republican form of government in each state. And what that means is that the voters are ultimately in charge. If something doesn't work, they can elect somebody new who can change things. How it works today is that you in a state that has collective bargaining with the public union, you can elect somebody new, but they can't change anything for the reasons Mark just said.
That's pretty fascinating. In fact, folks, Philip wrote a very interesting piece published by USA Today earlier this year. Philip, one of the things that you wrote in the piece, and to your point here, is you say a political solution is almost impossible. Union contracts have long tails tying the hands of successive political leaders. Political leaders are powerless without their cooperation. So is that potentially what North Carolina could have as its future? We know Representative Stevens saying they're doing everything they can to ensure that this doesn't happen. We hope that's the case, but if something goes wrong, so to speak, is that what we can expect?
And the rhetoric here is going back to the 1960s. It's saying, oh, this is just about worker rights. We just want to guarantee fairness. They're not guaranteeing fairness. They're getting rid of all accountability. I mean, they tell you how to do the job. As Mark said, you have to leave work at 5 o'clock. They mandate feather bedding so that in New York, a tunnel costs $2.5 billion a mile. The same tunnel in France costs $500 million, 120% as much for the mandated work rules. You can't hold anyone accountable. So literally 2 out of 300,000 teachers are fired each year from California, for performance. Are the teachers all that good? I mean, California is one of the worst school systems in the country. So there's no accountability. And the problem with no accountability is not that everybody in government is lousy. Most people are probably good and try to do hard. It's like poison in the culture. When people know that job performance doesn't matter, energy dissipates because you no longer have that sense of esprit de corps and the sense of let's get in there and do good for the public, because everybody knows it doesn't matter what you do. So it's terrible for public employees who are trying to do a good job. I mean, everything about it is terrible.
Representative
Well,
Stevens,
in my particular case, I saw people that, held positions that could not do the job. And instead of being let go because of their incompetence, they were just moved to a different position where they then could not do the job there. And then they were moved to a third position and so on. And they just were never let go. And therefore, why are they getting a full salary, benefits, et cetera, and literally not being able to work and not do what they should be doing?
Representative Stevens, it makes the work that you folks are doing in the legislature just even more important than we already thought it was, the description of what happens in other states that are not right to work states.
Well, yes, and what I wanted to do is back up a little bit. Probably the particularly NCAE was not as concerned in North Carolina about declaring themselves as a union and trying to negotiate. Is when I first came to the General Assembly, the Democrats had tons of policy that favored teachers. And one of the things that we did in the first 4 years we were there, and Treasurer Falwell was in the General Assembly with me then, is we passed a bill that said, at that point, teachers were entitled to hearings, and they were entitled to like a 7-step hearing before they could ever be let go or disciplined in any way. They could take every step, drag it out, which is in essence almost what a union would do. But this was put into statute that they could drag it forward like that and then get to step 7 where they're finally going to be terminated and they could voluntarily leave and nothing could be put in their record. Nothing, regardless of how bad it was. And that's what we changed. We said, now, once you get into that process, the school has to agree to let you go without something going into your record. I mean, so that was just one of many ways that they were already engaging in union activity using the Democrat charge to put into policy what in essence a union would normally do. Now we've been undoing some of that and saying, no, we would like to get rid of unfit teachers. We would like to pay teachers based on ability, not everybody getting the exact same thing, because we know not everybody brings the same thing to the table. Not everybody brings the same skills. You have teachers that excel and you have teachers that show up for a paycheck. And so trying to arrange some kind of differing scale for teachers based on their abilities has been something that the NCAE's fought us on every time. No merit pay, no mentoring pay, no distinction between teachers. Everyone should be treated the same and everyone should keep their job, and trying to get rid of a teacher is just absolutely the worst thing that you can do, which is, again, we started that as a Republican policy, which is, I think, why you've seen a big rise for the NCAE in the last 8 to 10 years.
Terry,
And
go ahead.
Oh, and it on the other hand, there's a movement among Democrats to ensure that the collective bargaining restrictions are repealed. I mean, if you look at three bills that were filed this session, House Bill 850, House Bill 586, and Senate Bill 701, all three of them have the provision that would repeal the statute that restricts public employee collective bargaining. And this is what we've seen in the last couple years, and should be of concern to taxpayers, is that while Democrats were originally responsible for the prohibition on collective bargaining of public sector employees in North Carolina, it's turned in recent years, and now they are actively looking to repeal that statute, and that's part of their legislative agenda. Now, with the Republican majorities, I don't really see them being very successful in doing so, but that doesn't mean in the future that this isn't going to be a serious consideration if the Democrats obtain a majority in the General Assembly to being part of their legislative agenda that would try to repeal a statute that has been on the books in North Carolina since 1959. So, this hasn't always been the case, but this we see among the Democratic Party a real radicalization when it comes to their agenda in being trying to make North Carolina a more pro-union state.
Terry, I think the history that you refer to is really fascinating. Can you give us a brief summary of actually how that ban on public sector collective bargaining came into play?
Sure. What we had was a series of federal laws that were passed with regard to curbing unionization after some violence and other discord broke out in the following the Second World War. And in North Carolina, Democratic Representative Frank Snepp of Mecklenburg County introduced a bill that would prohibit public sector bargaining because he saw that Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters were trying to organize the Charlotte Police Department. And in a newspaper interview, he declared that there's been an obvious trend to unions to move in on local government, especially police departments, and just as obviously, it must be stopped, is what Snepp said. So there were opponents of the bill, of course, that tried to get Snepp and his colleagues to not pass this kind of prohibition. In fact, what they did was they accused Snepp and others of being in the pockets of Charles Cannon of Cannon Mills in Kannapolis, which was a massive textile operation that had resisted collective bargaining in the private sector for many years. In fact, North Carolina, the interesting dynamic is that before we banned public sector collective bargaining in 1959, there was a great deal of union struggle in three industries in particular: the textile industry, the furniture industry, and the tobacco industry. So I think that lawmakers were seeing a lot of the strife that was occurring in the private sector and decided in 1959 to take action to ensure that that didn't happen in the public sector. And of course, that law has been on the books since 1959, and now a Democrat who created that bill, and now his same party is trying to repeal that bill through sort of in the name of worker rights, in the name of economic security. Mm-hmm. And this is where the Democratic Party is moving in North Carolina, is toward more unionization and encouraging unionization among private sector employees.
Representative Stevens, that's such a fascinating history, and how the Democrat Party is now flipped on this. And you were active, obviously, as a House Speaker, the Speaker Pro Tem. Do you hear those arguments from your Democratic colleagues, and do they understand the history in this state?
I think probably AOC said it better. Facts don't matter, just their story does. You know, it's what we want now, not what the history might actually be. I mean, if you listen to them, Republicans caused slavery, didn't free slavery. Republicans started the KKK. I mean, history doesn't matter. They want their story told, and they'll just say whatever they want to pander to a base. But no, none of them have come forward. They know that those bills are not likely to get heard, and so they don't even talk. It really is more about filing it to pander to a base. And the NCAE is considered a large base for the Democrats. They don't support any Republican. They don't talk. My own experience, I went to, we have convocation for the schools systems each year, and I was invited to come to the convocation and told, sit over here. It won't be a political issue. We will acknowledge your presence, but we're not going to talk politics. Then they had the NCAE representative on the stage who stood up and said, if you want to be a part of changing this, you have to join us, because the Republicans are really going to destroy everything we do for you as teachers. And if you're not part of our situation, then you're not part of it. I told them I'd not come back to another convocation that was going to be apolitical when people like that were going to be allowed to speak. So
really unfortunate.
Yeah, you know, I'd like to say, I think it's important as this progresses to think about the narrative of opposing it, because too often the narrative is, let's get rid of bad people, or teacher, you know, get turned into teachers are bad people and they have rights and stuff. Whereas in fact, you know, one of the worst victims of collective bargaining are the public employees themselves. You know, they get stuck in these situations like Mark Janus was saying, where you no longer have the authority to do a good job and the dignity of doing a good job. And it undermines democracy, and it undermines the schools. And it's all about basically, who do you want to control the schools? Do you want the teachers' union to control the schools? Or do you want the people in the school working with the parents and others to do the best job they can? And so, you know, I think there's a pro-teacher narrative here that's that people will understand and in fighting this, because it's too easy for them to say just, oh, it's all about our rights. It's not about their rights. It's about union leaders replacing elected leaders.
Mark, is that what you found, Mark, as you were going through this whole situation, that it was really about union leadership and the rules versus just rank and file folks who happen to be public employees?
Oh, absolutely. Because the rank and file get very little say in what happens. And in other words, I recall, you know, trying to go to my union steward, and it basically fell on deaf ears. And what my concerns were never responded to, and were never got any word back one way or the other. And I think you have to remember that, you know, you're talking about the NCAE. Well, let's look at a current case that Liberty Justice Center has in there in North Carolina. You know, in 2013, the General Assembly, you know, they created that Opportunity Scholarship Program, you know, which gave children of lower income families about $4,000 to get a better education by going into some kind of a private school if the parents wanted, and they were able to do that. Well, since 2015, we've had about approximately 10,000 students that have been helped with that opportunity, you know, that scholarship program. And what's going on currently? Well, you have the NCAE and the National Education Association is trying to block the program. Why? Well, because the scholarship funds are not going to public schools. They're going to private schools, parochial schools, and they want the program ended. And so they're going to force if they win their case, they're going to force thousands of children to leave their current school, and they're going to close the door on opportunities. Now, why is it that if the NCAE is so concerned about students and they're so concerned about education, which is what they talk about a lot, then why are they trying to shut down a project or this scholarship program that is going to give those children that opportunity that they claim, obviously, but they don't partake in and they want to get a good education? That's what frustrates me, is they talk one side, but then their actions speak totally different.
Terry, I think that situation frustrates you as well. And in addition to the fact that Governor Roy Cooper is no fan of the Opportunity Scholarship Program to help low-income families.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's very frustrating, and then of course, it's not just limited to um, private school scholarship programs. I mean, they do have a lawsuit to oppose that, but this is an organization that wants to limit choices generally. They of course don't like charter schools and the 120,000 students that we currently have in charter schools. We have nearly 200 charter schools. They would be fans of cutting that in half. We used to have a 100-school cap in North Carolina. I'm sure that the NCAA would love to get back to that 100-school cap because we've seen amazing growth in the charter school sector. And it's interesting how much they claim and of course, they have a lot of arguments with regard to the lawsuit, but one of the things that we often hear is that there's no accountability in these private school scholarship programs, and that's absolutely not the case. Not only do these students have to take a nationally normed test, but the parents hold them accountable. They hold these schools accountable. They hold the teachers accountable. And so just because they don't have to take the state test, which, by the way, they don't like either, they claim that there's no accountability related to these programs. And of course, the irony here is that schools that perform poorly, they're really not held accountable either. There's really very little that goes in the way of holding those schools accountable that fail to really teach kids to read and do math at grade level year after year. There's very little accountability in that public sector because those students continue going to those schools. So the NCAE, of course, wants to protect their membership. They want to convince their membership that they're doing everything that they can to oppose the quote unquote privatizers. But families are really voting with their feet and they're making their voice heard. And I think that's one of the reasons why the NCAA continues to lose membership is the fact that their members, their former members, really don't like having over $500 taken out of their account year after year while insulting families and the choices families make, including the choices that teachers and school employees' families make to have their children attend a private school or a charter school. So it's interesting that we're seeing this kind of legal tact to try to get rid of the Opportunity Scholarship Program. It shouldn't be really that surprising considering that they dislike school choice as much as they do. But it's unfortunate that they think so little of parents that they would try to seek a legal remedy to getting rid of an extremely popular program.
If I can add in right there just a moment, they use the exact same arguments with charter schools, and yet charter schools are probably more accountable to traditional public schools and can and will be shut down quicker. I have a school in my district that's a charter school that's getting ready to be shut down because of things that other schools do, but they sort of get by with it. The other thing we did in terms of attacking the NCAE and the union type issue is when we first got down there, one of the main reasons teachers were joining NCAE was to get basically malpractice insurance, liability insurance through the school system. But they could get it for 25% of the cost. And so we pay for it for them. That's another reason you've seen a mass exodus from the NCAE in North Carolina, because a lot of them realize that it's not doing anything. To your point too about who they represent, they don't represent teachers. When we had the budget cuts, the NCAA was all on board to freeze teacher salary in exchange for policy considerations that the national level wanted. When they talked about an extra penny that was going to go to teacher pay, and Bev Perdue put that in, an extra penny sales tax, not a dime of that went to teacher salaries because they still remained frozen. I mean, it's one of those, they just make a narrative and have the sheep to follow them. And I hate to feel that people are that way, but we are trying very hard. And I think we're successfully educating a lot of teachers that NCAE is not necessarily your friend. They've got their own political agenda.
Mark and Philip, as you can tell, the issue of the NCAE is a big one here in North Carolina, and they're influential and they are robust, and they're involved in a lot of public policy issues. And we saw during the pandemic that they certainly had the Governor Cooper's ear. Philip, as you've done your research on the issue of public unions and their impact, are you finding other sectors, other industries where you're seeing this very influential type of group?
Well, I mean, we've seen it in this past year with the police unions and those contracts. We've seen it certainly with the federal public employees and the AFSCME employees. Mark was, kind of a mandatory member there of state and local employees. I think as I'm listening to this, first of all, I think it's a really serious problem. And they come at it wearing sheep's clothing, whereas, what it does is it makes it so that schools in this country fail and public sector can't do its job. I mean, it's really that serious, because it's about manageability and it's about public culture. Paul Volcker, I think, was a Democrat, a very public spirited guy who died a couple of years ago. And there were 2 Volcker commissions where he studied the federal civil service. And he basically said that the culture of public service, just as the federal government, had deteriorated so badly that good graduates didn't want to go into work for government anymore, because the protections of, among other reasons, protections afforded poor workers drag down the culture of an entire office. Who wants to work? And then if you can't hold someone accountable, you can't actually give people the responsibility needed to use their own judgment. So then you get these 1,000-page rule books that tell teachers and everybody else exactly how to teach a classroom and all that kind of stuff, because you can't hold them accountable if they do a lousy job. So you tell them how to do their job, which guarantees that they fail, because it's just central planning. You got these 2, and it ties the hands of citizens too. So this is really a pernicious problem of American government more broadly. And as I'm listening to this, I really think it's important. It would be important, I think, to host some events that were focused on how to make schools better and how to empower teachers more, and stuff, rather than, I'd focus on not just on opposing the union, but also on doing the kind of things that teachers would want. I think that would be the best, might be the best kind of antidote to this.
Well, it is interesting that I think just inherently most people want to, in terms of their professional careers, they want to be treated as a professional. We certainly hear that call from teachers and the NCAE, but I think that crosses sectors. It really doesn't matter what you do if you're working for local government, state government, federal government, or private industry. You want to be respected for your skill and your knowledge. And it seems to me that one of the things that flows from that is that you understand not every employee should be graded at the A level and receive a high raise.
Right.
And you should understand that with being treated as a professional comes the responsibility, and some of that is not always good. Not everybody's great and should be promoted and receive a raise. Yet those seem to be issues that public sector unions will push against.
That's right.
They want to protect those who aren't performing.
Right, and the narrative is, I mean, you were saying this earlier, but the narrative is really completely phony. So the unions say, oh, it's just a matter of proving that they're not doing their job. It's a matter of proof. Okay, how do you prove who has good judgment? How do you prove who bores students and who really interests the student? How do you prove who tries hard? How do you prove almost anything important? And there was this case that I've written about where there was this horrible teacher, and she was in New York. They were trying to get rid of her, and the collective bargaining agreement made it almost impossible. She never graded papers. She never did what she never did anything a teacher was supposed to do. She was like completely useless as a teacher. And her defense was she had never been given specific instructions that she had to grade papers. She had never been given specific instructions that she had to be interesting, had to engage the interests of the students or something. I mean, that's the kind of sophistry that gets involved when you turn accountability into a legal battle. And so the unions say, oh, it's just a question of fairness. No, it's not. Look at the proof, it's in the pudding. When you've got these collective bargaining agreements, no one is accountable. And the effect of that isn't just it allows lots of lousy people. The effect is a lousy school and a lousy culture because people are dispirited by the fact that people aren't trying hard.
Well, let me provide an example of a local up in Minnesota that I learned about, that you could be on drugs 5 different times, such as methamphetamine or anything else, before you could be fired. Or you could show up and be totally drunk on, and show up to work over 3 times before you could be fired. So what does that teach our children?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, some of these work rules are just totally, beyond understanding.
A teacher in New York was convicted of selling cocaine to other teachers and went to jail. And when he got out of jail, the union contract required that he be reinstated.
Yeah.
Well, I think Stevens, excuse me, Representative Stevens, when you hear these discussions, what does that say to you as a public policymaker about your role in trying to make sure that public employees are treated fairly and that they have safe work conditions, et cetera, all the things that every person should be able to expect in their job situation, but at the same time, protect taxpayers and constituents from some of these, what are just silly or ridiculous rules and protections?
And that's the point exactly. And I appreciate you coming back to that. And I wanted to point out that we don't just concern ourselves with NCAE. We also are slowly watching the subtle development of the Police Benevolent Association. And they've started pumping some money into campaigns. And they're wanting police officers to be mandated statewide to be able to have a review if they're fired. They should be allowed to go before the county manager and the county council or the county commissioners and have a hearing to determine why they were fired and if it's fair. And that's all about fairness. And we keep saying, but that's a union. But they're attempting to sort of buy their way in, but we're watching that more subtly than we've been able to watch the NCAE because we weren't in charge at that time. The same thing with the teachers, going back to the Janus decision, how long before they start charging all of the other nurses who are not a member of the union to be a part of that? And Janus says that they can't, but we're seeing that's still sort of going to be challenged. They're going to be looking for some creative way to get some money out of these other people. And those are important policy decisions that we have. I will tell you that part of our government operations and oversight committee is to look when we have complaints about state agencies that are not behaving in a safe manner, not treating employees fairly. Often we contact the Highway Patrol and say, we're hearing the officers say there's this unsafe condition or this mandate or, not being able to go places. So we do provide some redress for them to at least review the situations. We're frequently doing, joint public safety oversight, where we talk about prisons and prison conditions and correctional officers that are getting injured at work. We have a very big concern in protecting them. And then in terms of wages, we try to say, okay, if you were in the private sector, what might you be making in a free market society? Are we getting enough employees because we don't have those? So we are doing some, again, 8 to 10 years to overturn 140 years of things going a certain way, trying to get to a more equitable free market approach to employees. We always, and they are funny because there are bureaucrats and we call them weebies. Their bureaucracy is full of it. You've never heard the term weebies.
No.
They're full of weebies. They're people who have the mentality in bureaucracy that say, we be here before you got here. We be here when you gone. We do it our way. We be. We do things way.
The entrenched, or at the federal level, we've heard the phrase the swamp.
Yeah. Well, but and that's a weebies. That's what we call them. Weebies here. But yes, they are entrenched. They will ignore us, and we have to. I've had a bill that I've run 3 or 4 times saying this is your job as a state agency. You must review your policy. You can't just establish policy. You must It must be gone through rules review. It must be related to your statutory authority to do your job. It's supposed to be reviewed regularly. And they keep ignoring me. But I've been there now long enough that they're realizing, okay, she's gonna make us do this. We be here, but she still be here too. So those weebies are having to listen to me a little bit more. And again, they'll probably drag their feet in hopes that I won't come back for another term. But that's some of what we deal with in the bureaucracy. But it's not that we're not trying to fix it. It's just sometimes there's such an entrenchment that we do have to take concern and to do oversight and to do review.
Mark, help us understand, if you would, Mark, kind of review for us briefly, if you could, of the Janus decision and your court case that you were central to, and the impact of that decision on the work that someone like a Representative Stevens is trying to do in a right-to-work state.
Well, the case came about very simply because during the HR intake process, when I joined the state back in 2007, nothing was ever said to me about joining a union. I never signed a pledge card. But it wasn't until I received my first paycheck and I saw this line item deduction along with, my taxes and, health costs, et cetera. It said union dues. And I'm thinking, why? I'm not a member of the union. Why am I paying union dues? And I very rapidly learned that in order to work in the state of Illinois as a government employee, you had to pay the union just to keep your job. So fast forward, through the different layers of courts that we had to go through in order to get our Supreme Court decision that in essence said you do not have to pay the union as a non-member to have a government job. And it freed approximately 5.5 million workers across the country that they now had the right not to pay if they did not want to join the union. And they should have that right. And it's now called Janus rights. Unfortunately, the unions are pushing back violently in some cases, where on the day of the decision, which is coming up next week, 3-year anniversary, what we're seeing is that in California, Governor Jerry Brown signed a piece of legislation that said that employees do not have the right within their workplace to even know that they have rights. And if a government manager tries to explain that to them, it's a misdemeanor and they could potentially lose their job. And we're seeing other cases around where individuals have learned about their Janus rights, but the union is fighting back to keep them in the fold, so to speak, where they try to leave. And they use what they call a windows. In other words, you can only resign within a certain time frame, whether it be 2 weeks, 10 days, or 1 week. So in essence, that gives up your right of your First Amendment rights to freedom of speech and freedom of association for, let's say, 50 weeks a year, which I think is unfathomable myself. But the whole point, the bottom line is this, individuals have the right under our Constitution. And unfortunately, the unions don't particularly agree with that right. And so therefore, they're doing everything they possibly can to circumvent the decision. And I find it just very, very interesting that if unions are so benevolent and they're so good like they claim, then why are they forcing people to stay in the union and not allowing them to have that choice and that voice on their own? That I kind of find is very ironic in a way, or extremely ironic.
Philip, have you considered the Janus case to be a legal game changer in terms of union influence, or is it, well, it's on the books, but?
Oh, no, it's a game changer, but it's, and it's an incredibly important historic decision. But in my view, it's only the first important step that we need now to understand that public unions have, as I said, have disempowered democratic processes. They're fundamentally anti-democratic, and they're taking away from voters their right to elect people who can manage the government. Representative Stevens was talking about the weebies. Well, why doesn't why don't officials in North Carolina have the power to dismiss people who don't follow orders. You can easily have a check and balance like they do in private companies sometimes, like a workers' committee to make sure they're not arbitrary firing. But if somebody has a job as a public servant and they refuse to do their job for political reasons, why should they keep their job? I mean, the civil service system was created in 1883 to prevent the spoil system, giving people jobs as political favors. It wasn't there to prevent people from being fired. It's called the merit system for a reason. You keep your job based on merit. So it was about getting rid of spoils, not about tenure. And what happened is that public employees ended up capturing the legislature and getting all these protections even before the union. So I think it's only the first step. I think it's really important to restore the accountability in government broadly, and I think a lot more has to be done to do that.
Now, of course, federally, we've got a very pro-union president in Joe Biden, and he talks about that, and our vice president mentions that when she's on the road as well. We've got the PRO Act that has been introduced in Congress. The folks over at the Competitive Enterprise Institute have taken a look at this and said, look, that if the PRO Act were to pass, it would abolish state right to work laws, among many other things. So I guess my question to our panel is, how much should we be concerned about what's happening at the federal level that could impact North Carolina?
Well, I think, it's a misnomer to call it the protecting the right to organize, because number one, you have the right to organize now without impediments. There are certain rules and regs that the NLRB has put forth, but that's to try to make the elections fair and equitable for all parties. But yet, on the other hand, if this PRO Act, which is quite frankly a union wish list, it's going to make it much harder for people, to have the elections, because there's going to be card checkoff. Well, actually, I should back up and say it'll be easier, because it'll be card checkoff. And it's going to throw the in towards the favor of the unions to be able to do what they want to do. And I think you're going to find that a lot of people are going to, just find it very, very difficult, to live with some of this. And I think the other side, is that people are not going to have the freedoms that they thought they had, and it's going to be an impediment to their freedoms. It's quite frankly one of the worst pieces of legislation I've ever seen.
I think Mark Janus's activism here is really instructive, because the people who are leading the Democratic Party aren't, by and large, proposing these because they think it's a good idea. They're proposing these laws and rules because there's enormously powerful union pressure for them to do that, and the unions support them. So it's completely political. It's not about right and wrong. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find any smart politician who thinks we're wrong in any of the stuff that we're talking about, even a Democrat. But the power of the unions is such that they can't resist it. So I think the solution here is in the courts, ultimately. I mean, you need to stand firm in the legislature, but to undo what's happened over the last 100 years, I think we're going to have to do what Mark did. We're going to have to go to the courts. I think that the collective bargaining state and local government is unconstitutional under the guarantee clause, because it's deprived people of their rights as democratic citizens. And without any question, the federal civil service system, which I've written a lot about, is unconstitutional under Article 2, because there's a whole line of Supreme Court precedent about the power of the president, the unwaivable power of the president to be able to get rid of federal employees he doesn't like. There's just a lot of authority on that under the Constitution. So I think there's a lot more to do here. And I do think, going to the beginning, this is a dangerous time.
Representative Stevens, how closely, or perhaps not very closely if that's the case, Are you watching things at the federal level and the PRO Act and things that might impact your ability as a policymaker here in North Carolina?
We get very, very concerned about that, and we try to respect boundaries where we can. I think the federal government does a lot of overreaching, and I think eventually the courts are going to have to weigh in on what is the role of Congress, what is the role of the states, what are the states' rights in these things, how can the states determine what they're going to do. For example, just going for an example, the marriage amendment. We passed the constitutional amendment that really did not get ruled on by the Supreme Court at all. But we have federal judges who were very liberal leaning who found a way to determine that be the way. So we're having a little bit of a distrust with the courts, but trying to recognize those separations of powers. And it's going to be very, very important for the Supreme Court at some point to rule on, here's what the federal government can do, here's what's reserved into the states. And we'll probably see us set up some boundaries between saying, okay, this is what we think the states can do. Now the federal government's done something different. Who's right? Who truly has the authority there? Which goes back to something Mr. King said, as the state government, why can't we just get rid of employees? Well, one, we have the State Personnel Act. But number two, the legislature doesn't hire these people. We simply send the laws and say, this is what you're supposed to be doing. It would be up to the governor or the administrative agencies to fire those employees who are not doing what they're supposed to do. So we have to recognize those boundaries, but continue to try to enforce and say, we sent you the law and you only have the authority to do what the law says you have the authority to do. But the administration of that is different. And that's part of, again, what do we do? The federal government versus the federal bureaucracy versus Congress telling them what to do. How far can this all go? We're really going to have to get some clarity. And I think that clarity is going to have to ultimately come from our Supreme Court, which again is probably why you see the liberals wanting to greatly expand the court to get those, the Constitution's a living, breathing document. It doesn't mean what it says it means.
Representative Stevens, we've talked a bit about the NCAE and the education sector. You mentioned the police sector. I believe it was the Police Benevolent Association. Are there other sectors and unions that are down at the legislature lobbying for certain things or against certain things that North Carolinians should be aware of, just that they are on the scene and that they have a pro-union mindset or goals?
That's a pretty broad question, and I haven't given it a lot of thought. I usually try to look at something and say, what is it? Who is it they're really representing? Who is it? And I'm just thinking of lobbyists, period, in terms of, the ones for the doctors or the medical association or the nurses or the nurse anesthetists or the nurse midwives and the lawyers and everybody's got their own little option, but how many of them are actually going toward unionization? I'm going to defer to Becky Gray.
Fair enough.
I can add something here.
Please, Terry.
If you look at the figures where the growth in the public sector unionization is, Representative Stevens is exactly right. One of the largest and fastest growing public sector unions is the Southern States Police Benevolent Association. We're also seeing extreme growth in the Correctional Peace Officers Foundation and the North Carolina Public Service Workers Union. This is UE Local 150. So while as earlier I mentioned that the NCAE is losing membership and they have had significant membership losses, the State Employees Association of North Carolina has had membership losses over the last 5 or 6 years of around 10%. The growth really is in those correctional peace officers and the Southern States Police Benevolent Association. So that's where I think we're going to start seeing the most robust growth and perhaps the most robust advocacy in the public sector unions is in those two sectors. And let me just go back real quick and talk about the fact of what is happening here is there's a feedback loop where the union supports politicians that support unions that support politicians. And I think that it's important that we need to break the feedback loop where the unions there's a check on the unions and identifying the fact that they are supporting lawmakers for the very fact that those lawmakers in turn provide benefits to the unions. And so it's that feedback loop that really has caused not only an increase in public sector spending, but it really fed the public sector unions in the 60s and 70s. That's why we had so much growth, is because there came a point where the public sector unions figured out that the way to ensure that the public sector provides the benefits to the unions was to support politicians like Joe Biden that would constantly be feeding them funds and benefits from the public purse.
Terry,
Well, and
go
and
ahead.
to back up what Terry says, I think it's very, very interesting that the individuals that are left out of that equation are the actual taxpayers themselves. They're the ones that actually support all these programs, with their dollars, and yet they don't have a seat at the table whatsoever.
Terry, to Mark's point about seat at the table and the public wanting to know, we have a question on Facebook here from Ken saying, would it make sense to have some kind of a scorecard that rates the charter schools versus the public in performance?
Well, we have
those already. I mean, there are
Yes.
national studies out there right and left that show, the performance levels in many different states and the difference between public and private, whether it be parochial, whether it be charter, whatever the case might be. So those studies are already out there. You just have to go out and do a little bit of a Google search and find them, and they are available.
Yeah, and we have a school report card system here in North Carolina. As long as we have tests, which we didn't last year, we have grades that are assigned to each of the schools. But I would actually take that one step further, because charter schools are outperforming districts with less money available, that with fewer resources. And I think perhaps a scorecard that took that into account, the fact that although they have fewer resources, charter schools are outperforming districts, would be a scorecard that I would certainly support. And so I agree that something like that is absolutely necessary, and I think would really be something that the public would appreciate in looking and being able to compare schools one against another in student performance and other metrics.
Yeah, let me just, one note of caution there. The most important thing I think the charter schools do is not readily measurable. Parent involvement, student socialization, core values, the kinds of stuff that schools used to be focused on and public schools no longer do. Charter schools, in my experience, are dramatically better. Dramatically. I mean, not even close. And all the, in test scores, the results can vary a little bit in charter schools, or sometimes and often better. But the real difference is in the school's ability to create future citizens.
Interesting. Representative Stevens, I'm going to give you the last word here today as our time is winding down. What comes next? What is your message to North Carolinians who are interested, and they're tuning into us today, and they're concerned about potentially the union footprint coming to North Carolina?
I think it is genuinely something to be concerned about, to be actively involved in advocating for. We at my hairdresser, was talking about her husband working for years, and there wasn't a union, and somebody bought the company out and invaded the pension. When you have a bad act like that, people really want to turn to unions. Protect us. But I think overall, they don't recognize that the union actually can create more harm than good. And that if there are other issues involving safety, security, wages, there's a different way to deal with it besides the union.
Representative Sarah Stevens is a Speaker Pro Tem in the North Carolina House of Representatives. Dr. Terry Stoops is my colleague here at the John Locke Foundation. He is the director of the Center for Effective Education. By the way, check out johnlocke.org. Check out our blog for Terry's writing and analysis. Also, his colleague, Dr. Bob Libke, writing on education issues in the NCAE as well at those two sites. Mark Janus has also been our guest. Mark is now a senior fellow at the Liberty Justice Center. And Philip Howard is the founder of Campaign for Common Good. By the way, that piece that Philip wrote for USA Today earlier this year, it's really something that's worth your time. If you're on Facebook, I think we're putting some links to some of these pieces into the comments section there. But let me tell you what the headline is on Mr. Howard's piece, in case you want to find that. Out of control, why public employee unions don't serve the public's best interests. Folks, thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate our panelists today giving us our time. Really good perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
And folks, want to thank you for tuning in as well. Once again, you've shown us by your interests that you are engaged North Carolinians and that you care about what's happening with public policy in North Carolina. And of course, that is the mission of the John Locke Foundation. What we do here is research, analysis, our reporting arm, Carolina Journal, really trying to make sure that you are informed and aware of what's happening in North Carolina, because we want you to be as free as possible, to be able to make the choices in your own life and for your kids and your grandkids that are best for them. That's what freedom, free markets, personal responsibility is all about, central to what we do here. I would ask you this today: if you want to support the work that we are doing, we would appreciate you making a tax-deductible donation to the work here at the John Locke Foundation. We are a 501c3 nonprofit group. We rely on your support. Just go to johnlocke.org. In the upper right-hand corner is the Donate tab. Just click on that. It's safe, secure, fast. In less than 2 minutes, you can make that tax-deductible donation. We would greatly appreciate your support. Lastly, I want to tell you to have a great week and join us again next week here for Shaftesbury Society. We will be back again with another engaging panel to help you know what's going on in North Carolina. On behalf of the entire John Locke Foundation team, I'm Donna Martinez. Have a great